Hello, everybody, and welcome to the fourth episode of the Global Weekly podcast. My name is James Robert Loughton, the director of the platform, and in today's episode, I'm once again joined by our editor and Oceania analyst, Munro Waller. On today's episode, we will be discussing the very interesting topic of Chinese economic foreign policy in the Pacific, going into how China is using its geopolitical power to leverage the region whilst competing against the West.
Thank you, James. Today's topic is one that's seen very little coverage, but is emblematic of China's economic foreign policy across the world, and as such, can teach us a lot about what they're doing. In particular, today we will be focusing on the way China is spending its money to cultivate support in the region of the Pacific, and what the implications are for this globally. To begin with, let's have a look at the region of the Pacific. The region contains 14 independent nations, many of which are among the smallest and poorest in the world, situated on tiny atolls with little by the way of natural resources and greatly threatened by climate change and rising sea levels. The entire region only has a combined GDP of $36 billion, which is absolutely tiny. For comparison, Belgium has a total GDP of $624 billion. So as a region, it is incredibly poor, and this has provided an opportunity for China to provide developmental aid and support.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting. And to begin with, we'll start with the largest country in the Pacific, Papua New Guinea, accounting for 73% of the entire region's GDP and receives around 43% of its total development aid. So when we're looking at the South Pacific region, Papua New Guinea is seen as almost a political leader. Despite its severe developmental, infrastructural and political issues, it is looked to as a power base in the region. It's also one of the most unique and diverse countries in the entire planet, having around 840 languages spoken by tiny communities spread across the multiple islands-based country. It also has a very weak government, as I've just said, with its multiple political crises, with little oversight beyond the urban centres. So, Munro, can you give us an outline of what Papua New Guinea's relationship is with China and how that relates to the topic of Chinese investment in the South Pacific?
Absolutely. So recently, Papua New Guinea has been somewhat courted by China through Offices of Developmental Aid, particularly through infrastructure. And this has been desperately needed in Papua New Guinea. It's incredibly underdeveloped, as you were saying. The roads don't really function. Outside of the urban centres, there's very little state oversight or any sort of policing. So the aid provided by China is really vital and important to the country, and actually sort of just develop it into a sort of functioning state. What has been particularly interesting is that China isn't by any means the largest donor for Papua New Guinea. Australia was and remains the nation's largest source of aid, and yet has in many senses sort of lost the hearts and minds of the nation's citizens, I think. Looking at the local media, you would very much get the impression that China is one of the more important friends to the country. But if you look at Western accounts and Western of what's going on there, you wouldn't get that impression at all. So just getting into actually what China's policy generally in the Pacific is as well, but this specifically applies to Papua New Guinea in its examples. So despite what you might expect, since 2016, China has been decreasing its overall spending on the Pacific, and since November 2021 has been focused on small and beautiful projects of international cooperation instead. And what these look like, infrastructure projects such as building hospitals, setting up student exchange programs, developing flight links, constructing road networks. And these projects, while costing a lot less money than larger developmental aid projects such as those being taken on by Australia, are eye-catching in ways that the Western aid isn't. So by contrast, Australia is giving a huge amount of money to the government, thereby only indirectly providing support to the nation's citizens. And the government is considered quite corrupt, so there's little trust that this money is going to the right places. And things like vaccine programs and all these things, while incredibly important to the health of the nation, they're kind of, they're not flashy, and they don't catch attention in the way that a new hospital with Mandarin on the front gets the attention of people. So it's really interesting to see how China's done a bit of a pivot here, whilst to a system which spends less money and actually gets them a lot more support. So, James, can you tell us a little bit about what China's doing elsewhere in the Pacific as well?
Of course. I think before we go into that, however, it's worth noting how China's tactics when it comes to geopolitical economic relations goes. And as you said, often it isn't in the form of traditional means where there is economic support provided in the form of loans that go towards societal and public infrastructure. rather, as you say, China are more involved in building these flashy architecture projects. We see that a lot in Africa through Belt and Road Initiative, where China are involved in building large airports, motorways. And these are very important, but also often these aren't accessible for most of the population. Rather, it's the political elite of these countries that usually benefits the most. And because of that, there are political tensions do arise from these infrastructure projects. And so it's important to look at the political relations before we can look at the economic relations. And so when we're looking at the South Pacific, it's worth noting that despite being the largest country and kind of the power base of the region, Papua New Guinea actually doesn't have the best relations. Even though it's the largest source of aid, it's the largest country that's provided with the most aid from China. If we're looking at the country that has the closest relations, I think it's worth noting the Solomon Islands. In 2019, the Prime Minister controversially broke ties with Taiwan in a dramatic sign that China's influence is growing in the region. And the result of that, there was extensive riots in November of 2021, which appear to have to some extent been caused by the change in allegiance. As we see in this region, China and Taiwan both compete for political leverage. So you often see both these countries essentially in a form of political bribery, using large sources of money in the form of usually developmental aid to win over these governments in their kind of hotly contested race to receive the most amount of recognition. Of course, by now, China is overwhelmingly recognized by the rest of the world. However, only a matter of decades ago, that wasn't the case, and Taiwan was hugely reliant on many of these small island countries for its recognition before it was removed from the UN. So going back to the Solomon Islands, in a leaked draft in a security agreement between China and the islands, China offered to provide the Solomon Islands directly with Chinese troops and military aid, possibly as a consequence of the riots. And I think this incident really shows that China isn't walking into this region without local opposition, and that hedging up unpopular governments is causing China to be associated with what could be perceived as corrupt regimes. So perhaps there is a difference. In Africa, we see these highly authoritarian regimes manage to kind of quell public discontent, and this allows China to easily work with these governments without little opposition. They can engage in these large-scale infrastructure projects without perhaps worrying about what the local populations are going to say. In the South Pacific, this doesn't seem to be the case. However, that hasn't stopped China. In the North Guadalcanal, the government is heralding a delivery of the first of 140 telecommunication towers, which was funded with resources obtained from Exim Bank with the assistance of China. So this is just another example of China using developmental aid for these countries who are desperate to modernize and urbanize. And China, despite public backlash, is very much willing to still keep kind of steamrolling ahead, bulldozing in, and going all in with this aid, not so much worrying about the consequences. I would also say this makes China indispensable for many of these governments. Yes, they have a lot of government backlash, but also these countries need to urbanize, they need to modernize. There's huge levels of inequality. And if China are going to be the ones to provide that easily, then perhaps that's worth perhaps not caring about public discontent as much and just allowing China to move in as this hugely influential power broker in the region.
I think it's really interesting what you said about Africa as well, because the contrast here is that these nations in the Pacific do not have the powerful states able to actually quell public dissent. So then they're so reliant on China to actually provide them with police, provide them with training. So Papua New Guinea as well has had to have a military agreement with the US recently, and there's a security agreement with Australia. So all of these things sort of show that the kind of hard power capacity of these states is really limited. So it's not same in the way that they are hedging up these regimes, but they also need to hedge up the actual regimes in a very practical sense, not just economically, which might get their hands dirty, and China, that is, and that could really hurt their popularity. It's also worth saying that China's support for the Solomon Islands was a massive wake-up call to Western powers who have been seemingly oblivious to their growing weakness in the region. The US didn't even have an ambassador in the Solomons before their switch in allegiance. And I think now what's becoming evident as a result of the growth in China's influence is the West's loss of power, or at least authority, in these regions, and this sense that the West has just completely neglected the Pacific as a place with nations who actually do need to, these relationships do need to be cultivated. They've just not been. They've just been completely neglected. And as a result, support from China does look really attractive because even though there are massive concerns related to it, it's support. And that means a lot to these countries. They really are struggling due to climate change, due to due to COVID. COVID was really difficult for these countries. And also the historical relationships with Western nations are informed by colonialism and imperialism. And that's because of the kind of cultural zeitgeist, that's become increasingly used in rhetoric to sort of push against Western ideals and Western support as a sort of imperialist means of grabbing power. And that's meant that China, as an alternative, because it's kind of a new power in the region, looks very attractive because it kind of seems not very dangerous. Although the Solomon Islands have had riots, and Papua New Guinea earlier this year had riots, which were likely unrelated, but there was a bit of anti-China sentiment in there, definitely. But returning to what I was saying about imperialism and colonialism, Fiji, as far as I'm aware, has been doing something really interesting there. And can you just let us know, James, what's been going on in Fiji and what their particular response has been to China's growth of power in the region?
Yeah, what's been happening in Fiji, I think, is really interesting. There's been a post-colonial concept developed called the Pacific Way, which advocates for the Pacific to move away from Western states and their influence, and instead reclaim the Pacific almost in a pan-nationalist, geographically political movement, developing a uniquely Pacific culture, and as the result of that, building an independent economy. Fiji has seen a distinct move towards China, is now one of the region's greatest advocates. China and Fiji have recently agreed to uphold a controversial policing cooperation, under which Fijian officers have been trained in China and provided with Chinese technology for policing. China has also been involved in upgrading ports and shipyards and has heavily invested in the Fijian economy. In this sense, China has supported the government's forms of sovereign power through strengthening its police force and has supported the nation's economy. So I think with this, what they call the Pacific Way concept, we see, once again, similar to Africa, China's playing on emerging political concepts. We see through things like the China-African summits that are held, China often upholds this idea that it is a colonial brother, or more so a post-colonial brother. It has been through the same historical legacy of oppression and resource looting that the former colonies of imperial empires have, and as such, there's a sense of camaraderie developing. If you're a post-colonial government, there has to be certain limitations that you accept. You accept that you are going to struggle to develop and compete directly against Western states because they've had hundreds of years of a head start. So if you want to compete in the international arena, you're going to have to perhaps give up some forms of sovereign power in order to get a head start. And if you're going to do this, would you rather take this support from your former colonial overlords, or perhaps from a more friendlier government which you see as being opposed geopolitically to those same former masters? So I think it's understandable why the Pacific Islands are cooperating to this extent. However, I think it's also important to note that a lot of this is, I would say, a facade. China isn't necessarily this benevolent friend of the Pacific, and if we go back to the Solomon Islands, we can see that there was significant resource looting used by China, specifically with the Win-Win mining investment firm, whose majority shareholders are based in China. And in 2019, they were actually caught by the Solomon Islands customs trying to smuggle 1.7 kilograms of pure gold out of the country directly through its mining office. So here we see an example where the Solomon Islands was using their natural resources, trying to build up wealth, but they don't have the means to actually extract it. So they allow China to come in, hopefully to speed up that development. And what happens? We see China directly taking this out of the country without perhaps the country itself economically benefiting. So I think this is still a worry that the Pacific Islands should have when it comes to economic cooperation. The same worry that they should have when you cooperate with any country. Of course, in the geopolitical international arena, countries are always going to be competing against each other. However, I think for these countries, they need to understand that sovereignty may be just as important as modernizing. what use is it in developing your country if you really start to lose control and you become almost a modern vassal state? So I think, kind of keeping on this, Munro, can you outline what China's goals are in the region specifically? Where is all this money going towards, and what is the point?
Well, that's the big question, really. And I think you got to the heart of it there by claiming that it was a facade. I don't know if I entirely agree with you in the sense that I think it's as much a facade as Western support is. I think all of these means of support have to be understood in the context of geopolitics. They can't be understood as earnest, benevolent attempts to get these countries the support they need. These aren't acts of charity. They're acts which are directly beneficial to the countries who are donating the aid. So Australia, of course, they've got an interest in investing money into Papua New Guinea and investing support in Papua New Guinea because Papua New Guinea is right next door to them. And they don't want this country to fall into anarchy because that would have massive implications for their domestic security. And that doesn't mean that Australia is somehow sort of perfidious or evil or even being underhand or with their developmental aid, but it just has to be understood in that context. And what makes Chinese aid particularly interesting is they are investing in these countries which have basically no implications for Chinese security or anything like that. So what are they actually trying to do? And a lot has been said by Western powers about China wanting to cripple small nations with unrealistic loans and the subsequent debt. And China has been really portrayed as like an incredibly predatory international actor. And I don't think in the Pacific, at the very least, in the present times, that's really a realistic assessment of China or its aims. China doesn't want to make an enemy out of these nations through a few short-term bad deals, right? And that example you said about the looting of gold, I think that is probably less of an example of sort of government policy or anything like that, but more just a few bad actors within that. But instead, China seems poised to develop friendships and deep roots in the area. That's its goal, in my understanding, right? They want to get these countries on board in the UN, voting with them, so sort of providing this support base so that there's sort of some sort of united front against, as you say, the Western powers who are now seen in a much more negative light in light of these concepts about imperialism and post-colonial studies becoming more current. And so it'd be really interesting to hear what you have to say about like what the Western powers feel about the growing influence of China, because I think that's a huge part of this, because it is kind of a dialectic process here.
Yeah, I think Western governments, and I think when we talk about the West, when it comes to the Pacific, we're mainly talking about the two main actors, America and Australia. To a lesser degree, you also have the influence of Britain and France, especially with their former colonial possessions. And of course, you also have New Zealand. But really, when it comes to this region, it is America and Australia paving the way for Western political maneuvering. And so these two powers are, of course, very concerned with the growth of Chinese influence, especially since 2019. I think there is a general fear of strategically important islands aligning with China. And these fears evidently are well-founded. The historical significance and geopolitical importance of the West being kind of shouldered out of the region, I think is self-evident. There are concerns about trade routes. That is hugely important, especially as we see China's Belt and Road Initiative kind of sweep its way throughout the world. We see trade routes and shipping lanes form a huge part of connecting ports across the world that are, I would say, kind of spreading China's soft power kind of globally. Defense is also a huge part of Western interest. In fact, I think defense takes the forefront, especially recently. We see the West taking a highly militarized approach to the South Pacific. We can look at something like AUKUS, so the Australia, America and Britain naval alliance. We see militarily this region is of huge importance, especially when it comes to the South China Sea conflict. China, for a number of decades now, have been trying to push out neighboring competitors out of the South China Sea. This is largely seen by many geopolitical commentators as a direct means of forming a stranglehold around Taiwan, trying to deny Taiwan the ability to rely on an American naval presence. So I think when it comes to the South Pacific, this is a direct extension of Western goals of providing a militarized and strategically safe kind of grounds to, I would say, kind of hold China back. And so if we want to specifically look at this, Australia and the United States have made a concerted effort to court Papua New Guinea, especially since China have become more and more influential. Australia signed a bilateral security agreement with Papua New Guinea in December of last year, and the US has also signed a contract agreement in May of last year. So Western powers are clearly trying to maintain, not only maintain, but reinforce their power in the region. And I think you have to give some credit to the Western governments because, as we said previously, China have offered to directly build military and naval bases in the Solomon Islands, for example. They're offering contracts with governments in policing. So if you are a Western power, you've had a history of kind of domineering these countries, you're going to want to keep that just kind of in a realist kind of worldview. You're not going to want to let go of that. So I think that's really the primary goal of the Western powers is they are terrified of China becoming more and more powerful. And I think they're worried that perhaps what's happening in a lot of the developing world, this kind of South-South cooperation, they don't want to lose out on that kind of historical influence.
No, I think what you said about security is really important. Absolutely. The Manus Island in Papua New Guinea, it has a joint US-Australia naval base on it. So those security agreements, those defence agreements are to sort of maintain that. But in Papua New Guinea, that's been very controversial and there were protests. And Marape, the Prime Minister of Papua New Guinea, outright said that he didn't want to be a staging post in a war, in a conflict between the US, Australia and China. And if you actually look at the Pacific, the geography of the Pacific, the US has Guam. That's their big naval base. That's their big source of power. And the worry is, I think, that if there were to be a conflict between Taiwan and China, which I mean, we don't have to get into the possibility of that, but I think there's a fear that actually the US has very, very weak roots in the region, and that's definitely what this is all a part of. And it's worth saying, though, that from the perspective of Pacific nations, China's growing influence is arguably quite a positive development, right? I mean, they're finally getting support and attention in a way that they just haven't been, because it hasn't been particularly politically relevant. Because if the US, if Australia have no reason to invest in these countries, why would they? I mean, you also have to keep in mind that in domestic terms, with the US becoming more isolationist, with Australia, it's now been led by a Labour government, but that Labour government is very much walking the line politically. It's not really taking and so these big sort of developmental loans are now becoming more politically contingent, because in the past you give out grants because it was seen as sort of part of your duty. Australia, they go on a lot about the Pacific family. And it's really interesting to see, especially how Australia has adapted to the language of the region. They use a very particular, very unique sort of language, which sounds very odd to European or like American listeners, where they talk a lot about family and sort of kinship and brotherhood and ties and all these things. And in that way, they have adapted well. But yeah, that imperialist sense and that history there, I think, does inform that relationship.
I completely agree. I think it is important to also focus on some of the positive developments. Of course, when it comes to kind of geopolitical commentary, it's very easy to fall into the trap of just saying, well, China are bad. China are getting too powerful. They're doing this, they're doing that. There are positive developments. I think we can look towards Nauru, for example, a tiny country that is hugely reliant on its neighbours for economic propping, essentially. They're so small that they can't even maintain their own currency, as is the case for many of these islands. So they are hugely reliant on Australia, for example, with one of the major banks being Bendigo and Alade operating the country's financial resources. However, this bank closed following numerous economic burdens. It decided to pull out of Nauru. And so China, seeing that opportunity, seeing that gap, rationally moved in. And Nauru has since signed a memorandum of understanding with the Bank of China to explore solutions and options to its quote-unquote the banking issue. And so what we see is the withdrawing of a major Australian bank, but also the withdrawing of Australian soft power. And this hasn't been forced by China. This is the result of Australia itself not deeming it feasible enough to maintain those economic positions. So we can't really blame China for kind of striking that opportunity. And I think that really plays into the whole region. We've seen it be hugely kind of ignored, I would say. This is of course, these are very small countries, but these are geographically crucial countries in global shipping lanes. And so there's a historical legacy of them being kind of left off the table, ignored. China's now kind of pushing that light onto the region again. China's saying, here's an opportunity we can move in. And so I think it's only reasonable that this is what's going to happen.
Well, exactly. I think that's the thing. We have to understand this as it's both China being proactive and moving into this region, but also the Western powers moving out. I think in Australia as well, it's become less politically sort of it's less attractive now to provide these aid things. It's not really seen in the same way that it used to be. The language about it has sort of changed. And interestingly, given a lot of the rhetoric about China, Australia is now the greatest source of loans in the region. And that's mainly because of aid from COVID to Papua New Guinea. There was a massive loan they gave out, which was the largest loan given out on the Pacific Aid map. And China hasn't really been able to use loans as well. So I think we have to understand this as China's filling a gap here. China's filling a niche, and for these nations, the main criticism that you can give is that China's hedging up corrupt nations. Australia and the US, on the whole, are more sensitive and are more careful in where they give their aid and how it's given when it comes to grants and loans. China really isn't. China will give money because China also is very, very wealthy. But what we're seeing as well with the international cooperation, these projects of international cooperation, it's just sort of small little things. And people really like that. People can get behind that. Although there is quite a lot of anti-Chinese sentiment as well. And I think that's because of what you were saying earlier, like this sense that there's sort of a lot of Chinese workers coming into countries and profiting from these infrastructure projects directly. And the people from those countries are really getting nothing out of it.
Yeah, I think I would completely agree with you there. I think it's easy for the West to kind of throw blame and say, look at what China are doing. This is wrong. Come back to us. Well, there's a reason they left you to begin with, and I think China is just playing this long game. They talk about their century-long plans. This plays into it. They have strategic goals that are going to cover pretty much every region on the globe, and so if the West wants to counter that, they're going to have to really put in the effort. So I think when we're looking at Chinese relations to the South Pacific, I think on a final note, I would kind of ask you, where do you see kind of the future of this going? We see China has maintained, I would say, two kind of forms of multilateral institutions. You have one like BRICS, which is perhaps economically very loosely organized. You don't see a uniformed kind of BRICS economic plans as much. Rather, it's more of a political movement. It's seen as this multipolar force, brings together loosely affiliated countries that have the same goal of pushing Western influence perhaps out of the international stage, or instead you could say it as just increasing their own voice if you're to be less negative. On the other hand, you have something like the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, which politically you don't really hear much of. And I think the reason for that is because they're much more focused on directly creating economic infrastructure that integrates these countries, specifically between China, Russia, and Central Asia. So you have one form of multilateral institution that is perhaps more political and one that is perhaps more integrative. When it comes to the South Pacific, does this region play into either one of those, or is it something entirely new?
Well, I think that's a large appeal of China in the region as well, is that they're seen as a means to integrate these economies, to actually develop the infrastructure necessary for these economies to become global and for trade to actually be feasible. Like, again, return to Papua New Guinea, their road network just doesn't work. I mean, there's barely one at all. It's very unpaved. There's natural disasters or floods and all sorts of things all the time. So, actually China coming in, building infrastructure, which is quite explicitly political, does go a long way for them integrating these economies. And I think that's a lot, has to be understood as a large part of this. And I think, just to sort of conclude here, I think we have to understand China's influence. They are doing what big powers do on the global stage. And this is seen as a threat by Western powers because they're not used to a large power since the end of the Cold War doing this sort of thing. And whereas in the Cold War you had two ideologies competing against each other and fighting on kind of ideological terms, and now what we're seeing is basically the US pulling out, being more isolationist, and China basically moving in, working with maybe corrupt governments or maybe governments which are perceived as corrupt at least, in a way that the US isn't, hedging them up, getting support as a result in the UN and elsewhere. And so the West feels incredibly threatened. What has to be done in response? Well, basically the West needs to spend a lot more money on these things and try and cultivate support, maybe change the language, but also there's a lot of historical factors which, at this point, honestly, it's quite hard to fight against.
Yeah, I gotta say, I do agree with that. I think we can't just kind of play this shifting blame game of saying, well, this country is corrupt, so why are we going to? Because at the end of the day, if China weren't involved in the region, I think the West or perhaps another power would also be dealing with these same figures. So I think the West needs to provide more positive multilateral engagement, which they do. As we've talked before, Australia is one of the largest providers of vaccinations. There's many positive economic forms of engagement, and I think the West needs to perhaps increase that. As you say, we've seen the West and America specifically perhaps pull out of influence or redirect that influence towards other areas. And the risk of that is seeing perhaps China take in that gap. So if the West wishes to reinforce itself, it's going to need to take the region perhaps a lot more seriously than it has before. So thank you, Munro. I want to thank all our listeners and our readers for tuning in to this episode of the Global Weekly podcast. And we look forward to covering the next topic in the next episode. Thank you.